Well, Thanksgiving is now behind us. So have you made your lists? Have you checked them twice? I hope you haven't been naughty, but instead have been nice. Were you nice? Really? Even back on Friday, were you nice? Are you sure? Or maybe are some of you on your spouse's naughty list for sitting and watching football when you should have been up helping? That's not just for the men. Sometimes it's the women that do that, right? It could happen. It's amazing, though, how this holiday season, where we're supposed to be starting with thankfulness and moving toward this remembrance of the Lord coming to earth in Jesus, that we are supposed to be focusing on that, and instead it so easily gets twisted into this materialistic display of overindulgence, spending too much money, family drama. Maybe there was a little bit of that at your house this year. I'm delighted to say that around the tables where I was, there was remarkably little of that, and for that I'm grateful. But that does happen from time to time. It's kind of a universal human truth. Wherever family gathers together in observance of a holiday, there's going to be some drama, or just whenever they gather together. And you know, it's so universal that it's a truth that Jesus addressed. Family drama, that Jesus had to talk about it, and he did so at least in one place, in Luke chapter 12, when a man comes to him, and he's asking about wealth, but he's also asking about family. Normally, we think of this story that contains the parable about the rich fool, as the parable is known. We normally think about it as a way to talk about materialism, but it's also a little bit about family dynamics, because it's an answer to a question that is asked of Jesus about the way this young man's brother is behaving towards him. And so I want to invite you now to open your Bibles to Luke chapter 12, and we're going to start at verse 13 and read through 21. You can follow along on the screen or use a smart device if you so desire, but I want to encourage you to read along with me at Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to him being Jesus, someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I'll do this. I'll tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I'll store up all my grain and goods. And I'll say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.'" It's interesting, that rich man talked to himself a lot, didn't he? Did you notice there's something missing in that conversation? He's only talking to himself, and who should he be talking to? He should be talking to God. And at the very least, you should be listening for what God has to say to him about this overabundance of wealth that he has. But instead, he's talking to himself. He's saying, "Wow, self, I've got all this stuff now. Now I have so much stuff, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down these barns and build larger ones." And then he says, "And then once I get done doing that, I'll be able to say to my soul, Soul, you've almost got enough now. Now you can relax. Now you can eat and drink and be merry." By the time he does hear from God, it's too late. Because at that very moment, his life is being required of him. And so now God is saying to him, all this work that you've put into this, whose will the fruit of that labor be? It won't belong to you anymore. And so there's a sense of pointlessness to this striving after more and more worldly possessions. And so my first point for this morning is that striving for stuff is senseless. You know, senseless is a pretty strong word. I wanted to use a little bit stronger one, but wiser heads reined me in a little bit for using a word that many of us, if we say it in our household, we get in trouble, the S word, not the one that you can't say on TV. I mean, they say lots of stuff on TV, right? But I'm talking about the one that is an insult to someone's intelligence, when you're attacking their mental ability. That S word, where you're basically calling someone unintelligent, dumb. But I really wanted to convey the strength of the word that is being used there. When God says to this rich man, "You fool," that's not just a fool. It's not even fool. It's fool. There's a strength and a power to this word. In fact, so strong is the power behind this word that there are even commandments by Jesus where he says, be careful about using this word. Don't just call someone a fool for the sake of calling him a fool. I noticed something interesting as I was looking at retailers' websites and at their stores, and strictly for purposes of researching for the message, of course, Going out into the stores and looking at websites. I even looked at one particular retailer, a store that's, kind of a mega center of sorts. And I looked at their website, and I looked as I walked into the store, there was something that caught my attention. Almost everywhere, they were pushing screens. You know what I mean? And I'm kind of convicted by it as I'm saying that because I've got one of them right here in front of me. Those screens whose glow captivates us, televisions, tablets, cellular phones, and so on and so forth. As I was watching this particular retailer's banner scroll across the different items that were coming up for the Black Friday deals, it was all screens, television, computer, tablet, cell phone, and so on and so forth. It was all screens. And those screens are interesting, these devices that kind of captivate our eyes and brains and keep us from moving. They encourage us to sit still while we are transfixed by their cool glow. And then, as you look a little further into these websites and into these retailers, you begin to notice fitness devices, Fitbits, exercise equipment, treadmills, and the like, because we've been sitting still so long at our screens that we need to get up and get some exercise. It's an interesting tension. We kind of send ourselves running in circles, working hard to get more stuff that'll keep us from allowing our bodies to sit still for too long. We get ourselves so distracted with this cycle that we don't have any time left for God and for people. And we've got to turn that around. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 10 and 11 puts it like this. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar. And the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. Since all of these things are thus to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? You see, what Peter is saying to the church, what God is saying to us, is that this is pointless. To work so hard for things like these shiny baubles that will eventually one day be nothing more than dust, that will be reduced to their elements at some point in the future. We work so hard to get these shiny things, and yet before we even realize it, they're already beginning to lose their luster in our eyes. We didn't just grab a brand new TV to put up here, although that might have made the point better. But even as I look at this one, I realize this one's a few years old. It doesn't seem as attractive as once it did when it was a brand new item. And so we labor for these things that eventually are going to wear out, and even in the time between them, we don't have them very long before we already want the next latest, greatest model. We work so hard thinking that if we work a little harder and attain a little more, we'll get to this point where we can stop and we can rest. But here's what I want to say to you, brothers and sisters, and my second point is that the life of luxury is a lie. The life of luxury is a lie. This is this myth that we tell ourselves that someday we're going to get to this point and we're going to be able to get here and we're going to be able to just stop. and not work any harder. We're going to be able to just enjoy the fruits of our labor, like the guy in the parable for this morning who thinks, he goes, okay, just a little bit farther because now I've got all this stuff. Now I've got to have something to put it in, so I just have to work a little harder to build these new barns. And then before he gets there, his life is over. So there's 3 ways that this lie fails us. First, we get to whatever that imaginary level is in our minds, and we realize we need just a little bit more. We're satisfied like this long, and then we want to grab one more thing. We want to take just a little bit more. Or the second way would be that we work hard to acquire this wealth, and then we have to work hard to protect it. Maybe we do get to that point where we think, okay, this is good. I'm going to stay right here at this level, but now others want a piece of what I've got. There's no end to the folks who want that. Lottery winners. I'm sure you've heard various different statistics about them, but one of the interesting things about lottery winners is relationships change. Friends who used to be really good friends are not friends anymore, and family members are alienated because everybody wants just a little bit, and there's no end to the people who come knocking looking for a little piece of what they now have. Or if someone suddenly becomes known for being wealthy, if that becomes public knowledge, then there's, people, everybody's coming to ask for a donation. People like me with nonprofits are going to people and asking them, hey, a little donation might be nice. The third way that this fails us is that we lose purpose and meaning. Let's suppose we really do get to that point where we can just stop and rest. We don't have to work anymore, and so we take that and we just say, fine, I'm not doing anything else anymore. I'm just gonna chill. I'm just gonna relax. We lose purpose and meaning. We tell ourselves that we can reach this magical land where we no longer have to work and our life begins to fall apart around us. The truth is that we're designed to have this sense of work and purpose in our lives. Pastor Trudy puts it like this. She says, what gets you up in the morning and what puts you to bed at night? Hopefully it's not sound system issues. What gets you up in the morning and what puts you to bed at night? Put a little bit differently, is there something for which you have to rise early on a regular basis, some work that has to be accomplished during the course of that day? And then something that you've worked hard enough on so that at night you've spent so much energy and so much time and attention that you're tired enough from a good hard day's work that you sleep well. Let me illustrate it another way. A couple of years ago, I was at a training for the conference's Board of Pensions and Health Benefits on which I was serving at that time. I was at this training, and so of course with Board of Pensions and Health Benefits, one of the subjects we're going to be talking about is retirement. And we were talking about retirement, and as we were doing so, the folks at our table began a conversation about what retirement looks like, what our expectations of retirement are. And one of the guys seated at the table told the story about someone he knew who was coming up to retirement, and he had asked him, hey man, what are you going to do with your retirement now that you're done? Now what you need to know about this guy is he worked for the railroad, or had worked for the railroad all his life, all of his working life. And as he was coming up to retirement, he says, I drove that train from this point to this point in the mornings, and in the afternoons I drove it back to its original point, and I just got so tired of driving back and forth, and apparently this guy couldn't stand his employer very much, the people who were his bosses. And so he said, so what I've done is I've purchased me a house up on a hill that overlooks that line. And I'm going to get up there and I'm going to watch some other poor individual. Yeah, he said something else. I'm going to watch some other poor individual drive that train back and forth day in and day out, day after day. And I'm going to sit there and I'm just going to laugh. Within 6 months, the guy was dead. Because whether he liked it or not, whether he realized it or not, that job had given him a sense of purpose, a sense of mission. It gave him something to get him up in the morning and to put him to bed at night. That sense of having meaningful work, even if we don't understand how meaningful that work is, gives us enough to keep going, to wake up the next day and to go to bed at night. That's really in the essence of the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment's the one about the Sabbath, but it's really about a lot more than the Sabbath. And remember, with the laws, they aren't just laws for the sake of making us obey these arbitrary rules. These laws are a gift of grace. Yes, even the law is grace from God. The fourth commandment says this: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. In other words, God designed us to work and rest, to work and rest. To work for 6 days and then take a day off. To work and to work hard and then take a vacation. To work and work hard and then maybe go into retirement, but do so with a sense of purpose and something to do with that retirement. Really, that commandment is as much about the work that we do as it is about the time we take for Sabbath. In fact, if you looked at it just in percentage of time, it would be more about the work. That's the way that we find fulfillment, satisfaction, and purpose in our lives, in so many ways, among others. But to have meaningful work is a big part of that. Third, this morning, I would say, don't cheat on God. That's the way I like to think about idolatry. Don't cheat on God. Yeah, I'm using a relational term, like a relationship between, a husband and a wife, a boyfriend and a girlfriend. They're not going to cheat on each other, or they shouldn't cheat on each other. And when they do, it's considered a violation of the relationship. It's considered taking some of that affection and that attention that was reserved for that one and putting it somewhere else. You see, idolatry is defined as having something that we worship that gets in the way of our worship with God. Anything that we worship gets in the way of our worship of God. So if we put something in that place, we're taking attention and affection that was intended to be reserved for God, and we're spending that on something else. It's also in the commandment itself. God speaks about idolatry as this relationship. He says, after commanding his people not to have idols that they worship, not to worship anything else, he says in Exodus 25, he says, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Jealousy. God doesn't want that attention, that affection that is intended to be directed toward him to be directed elsewhere. I know I've mentioned it recently, but the entire book of the prophet Hosea is built around this image of a wife cheating on a husband. And the intent of that is that's God saying to the people, you have cheated on me. You have taken that affection reserved for me and put it someplace else. I've already mentioned lottery winners this morning, and probably many of us have heard this statistic that a significant number of them, one article I read said a third of them, end up bankrupt. But again, I'll mention that one of the other statistics that we don't hear as much is that most of them lose friends, that most of them alienate the affections of family members. It gets in the way of those relationships. So if it can get in the way of those relationships, certainly it can get in the way of our relationship with God, this pursuit of money, this guarding of our material resources and wealth, this acquiring of more and more stuff. All that time and effort spent on those efforts is effort and time and energy that could have been spent for the sake of God's kingdom. Now, that's not to say, and hear me very clearly on this, I'm not saying that everyone who has some form, some measure of wealth must not be being faithful to God, or that the reverse is also not true, that if someone doesn't have very much in terms of physical, material resources, that it must mean that they somehow don't have enough faith or that they've been disobedient. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but what I do know is that God has chosen to bless some more than others with amounts of material wealth. But I do know this, that to all of us, He has, whatever amount of wealth that He's given to us, He has given it to us with a purpose. He's given us that amount of wealth, riches, for a reason, for a purpose. There are some for whom God has seen fit to place wealth into their hands, but that usually comes with a purpose. They are intended to honor God with it. We're all intended to honor God with whatever we have, but also to bless others. Fourth and finally this morning, let me point to something that my daughter got my attention with several years back very, very powerfully. And that is that you're already rich. We're all already rich. Or at least, let me put it this way, you come from a wealthy family. You've been adopted into the family of God. You have a Father in heaven. Whatever it is that you want or desire or think you need, God already owns it. When Claire was about 4 or 5 years old, that's my daughter, when Claire was about 4 or 5 years old, we noticed that she had this generous streak in her. And I wouldn't like that when I was her age, when I was that age. She went to the doctor's office, and she had to have a shot. And as is often the case when you go to the doctor and you have to get a shot when you're a little kid, they give you a sucker. And she received a sucker from the nurse who was discharging us that day. And she said, "Hey, could I have 2 more, one for each of my brothers?" And the nurse obliged her, and she really did give those 2 suckers to her brothers, even though, like I said, when I was that age, those would have been for me. But she blessed them in equal measure to what she had been blessed. And as I was bragging on her about this at church one day shortly thereafter, I was hanging out with some folks out in the front entry area of the church, and I was talking about this, and she was nearby, and I wanted her to hear me bragging on her because I wanted to encourage this kind of behavior, this kind of generosity. And so I looked at her and I said, "Claire, I hope God makes you rich someday so that you can bless others with that wealth." And she just looked me square in the eyes. She said, "Oh, Daddy, we already are rich." Well, the preacher got schooled by his daughter that day. The 50th Psalm puts it this way: "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the fields is mine." Now, the Lord was saying this through the psalmist to the people of Israel in response to their ever more lavish sacrifices that they were giving to God in order to satisfy His wrath or to satisfy His need for righteousness on their behalf, or a sacrifice for their righteousness. But God's pointing out to them, it's not like you can outgive me. Your generosity needs not only to honor me, but also to honor those that I put around you. If you're going to neglect the cause of the widow and the orphan, these sacrifices are meaningless. This stuff already belongs to me anyway. You can't give me anything that I don't already have. So reflect my character, God is saying to His people. The main point for this morning is exactly what Jesus said in the parable of this rich man. Your life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. Your life instead is defined by who God says you are and the purpose to which He has called you. If Jesus has blessed you with something and says, give it away, then give it away. If Jesus says, use it to bless others, then use it to bless others. If God says, invest it for the cause of the kingdom, then invest it for the cause of the kingdom. Whatever the case is, you need to have those conversations with God regarding how He wants you to spend not just your resources, but your time and your energy, your talent, your abilities. What does God want you to spend your life pursuing? And what does He want you to do with the wealth that He's put into your hands?